Hey, everybody, this is Reagan Knope. Welcome back to the Oregon Bridge.
I got elected through that process because other people bought into the idea that I would do a good job, more so than I was fascinating to anybody. The couple people I convinced then were my champions. I wish we could get some serious people to run for the U.S. Senate, somebody that lives in Oregon, somebody that's from Oregon, somebody that shares Oregon values. When you look at how much of our state is forest, it's 50% of the state. The fact of the matter, there are more trees in Oregon today than there have ever been in the history of the state. There's no greater inspiration than Ronald Reagan. Like, there just isn't.
All right, folks. Today, our guest is State Representative Daniel Bonham, representing House District 59 and running for State Senate District 26. Reagan, give us a little info about Rep. Bonham.
Yeah, I got to know Rep. Bonham kind of working in the Capitol, and he's a great guy. Grew up in Tigard. Ben, big fan of Tigard, being from Tigard. We learned about that. We learned about his time at Linfield College, where he met his wife, Lori. Business degree, director of marketing for Evergreen International Aviation, not the museum, because I was confused. He moved to the Dalles, bought Maupin stoves and spas. He's been a small business owner, got appointed to the legislature, and now he's running for state senate. His background was super interesting to me, and I think everyone else will really enjoy this too.
Yeah, I think a couple interesting bits as my dog comes to say hello. One, he has some very strong feelings about Ron Wyden. Not a big fan, and he is pretty harsh about the senator, who I think we all agree is going to be overwhelmingly reelected for the, fourth time. Pretty popular guy, but Rep. Bonham doesn't like him, or at least disagrees with his style of campaigning this cycle. But alternatively, seems to be a huge fan of Peter Michael Coleman Courtney. So we get under the hood on how Rep. Bonham views two major figures in Oregon Democratic politics. We talk about his background. We talk about the issues he's hearing on the doors in his own community and how that's shifted from primary to general. So I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed the opportunity to chat with him. Reagan, what was your takeaway?
I think my biggest takeaway is that he gets focused when he's working on something, whether it was his business or running for a legislature. Man, it just feels like he's got that laser focus. And when he was here with us, he was a laser focused on this conversation and trying to give us a lot of information in a little bit of time, which I think is awesome. And my favorite fun fact about him is he is a former podcaster, hoping that he comes back to podcasting at some point. But we talk about that too. People should check out his currently in sleep mode, I suppose, podcast, Main Street Politics with Daniel Bonham. He recorded a bunch of episodes in 2019 with some pretty good and pretty interesting figures in Oregon politics.
Last note, I will say kudos to him for coming on the pod in the peak of campaign season in a relatively competitive legislative district. If you are a candidate for the state legislature in a relatively competitive district and you want to come on the podcast, let us know. We would love to have you on. We're probably going to have a handful of episodes recorded before Election Day. We might do, if we have extra content, we might do a couple in a week. We might stick with weekly, but if you're interested in coming on, we'd love to talk with you. So with that, let's get to the interview with Representative Daniel Bonham. All right, Representative Daniel Bonham, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, Reagan, for having me. Appreciate you guys.
Reagan, I believe this is where you wanted to insert your one-liner.
Oh gosh, what did I even write in my notes here? I'm trying to arrange my screens because I forgot to do it. Daniel Bonham is my second favorite redhead in the legislature after my father, Senator Tim Knope. The redheaded caucus power in Oregon is now ever expanding.
Perhaps the worst delivery of a one-liner in podcast history, but it's a pretty funny joke, so we'll allow it. Where I wanted to start, Representative, is it true that you have some roots in Tigard? Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Class of 95. So I grew up back behind Tigard Fred Meyer, and went to Fowler, junior high back then. We weren't even middle school. We were junior high. And then went to Tigard High. I was there the year we split Tigard Tualatin.
Mm-hmm.
So back then, they gave us the choice where we wanted to go. And I'm the youngest of 6 kids. Most of my brothers and sisters, bounced around California growing up, but we moved to Tigard when I was a year old. And so all of us at that point then graduated from Tigard High. So I was the 6th of 6 Bonham kids coming through. So by the time I got there, people were like, oh, another Bonham.
So my main question here is, you basically won the lottery. You were raised in the best place in Oregon, in Tigard, and then you left. So can you explain where your life diverged and you ended up in your current district?
Yeah, and I really did love growing up in Tigard. Like, it was a great time to be there. I grew up in a generation where we played kick the can. The parents did tell us to go outside and play until the street lights came on, and that's when it was time to come home. Like, that was my generation, the big wheels and all that stuff. Playing flag football out in the streets, touch football, whatever, out in the streets, run to the car and then come this way. And so we did all that stuff, and then graduated from Tigard and went to Linfield College. And so down in McMinnville, I'd gone down there for like a church camp. Fellowship of Christian Athletes had a camp there. And I thought the campus was cool. It was far enough from home to feel like I left for school, and close enough to where if I needed to do laundry on a weekend, I could call my mom and say, can you come get me? And I'd love a home cooked meal, stuff like that. So I went to Linfield. I met my wife my sophomore year, her freshman year, at the bowling alley. There was like the welcome week. Everybody could bowl. And so we got there early, and it was my friend Joe Burks and I were just bowling by ourselves. And then she and her friend Carissa started bowling in the lane next to us. And then people started shuffling in, and she's like, maybe we should bowl together and give room for more people. I was like, perfect. Like, yes.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Singles bowling becomes doubles bowling.
It was great. And we hit it off, and we basically started dating that week. And 2 years later to the day, we got married. And so I stayed, in the area. We built a house in McMinnville, then we built a house in Dayton. And so I worked at Evergreen Airlines in McMinnville for 7 years. And then one day, Lori just, she was tired of the mold, the mildew, the clouds, the rain, the depression you go through every winter when you don't see the sun for and the allergies she didn't have growing up. And so I said, well, this is Oregon weather. What are you thinking? You thinking like California, Arizona? And she said, no, just the other side of the Cascades. The Dalles is her hometown. So when we started looking for where we could go, we looked at Bend, we looked at Redmond, we looked at Madras, we looked at the Dalles, and she found a couple businesses for sale in the Dalles that we thought we could make a go of. And so we did. And 15 years later, I'm here, still running my small business. And our kids are grown now. Our kids are 24 and 22. They both go to school down in Phoenix. And so, this is where we are now. And this is why we left Tigard. I still go back. And I will say the one thing I don't miss is the congestion. If you're in your car out
that's true
for 60 minutes, you just went 60 miles. You might have gotten from one end of 217 to the other. But yeah, it's a different pace of life out here. And it kind of reminds me of when I grew up in Tigard.
Yeah. Well, to prove your point, we're recording this podcast 10 minutes late today, in part because on my drive home, you remember Durham Road, I'm sure,
of course.
Right off of Tigard High School. Well, Durham Road is the site of the Tigard High homecoming parade today.
Yeah.
So just imagine Friday afternoon traffic, but without Durham Road. That's where we are today.
So my junior year in that parade, we made a float, we put a hammock on the back, and I borrowed the Tiger mascot.
Yeah.
And so, there I was with that huge tiger head, trying to put me in the hammock. I fell out multiple times and ultimately walked the parade. But yeah, that was my junior year. That parade, that was fun.
Were you like a leadership kid in high school? Like, are people surprised you're in politics, or they were like, of course, Bonham's in politics?
I got in trouble at my 20-year reunion for talking politics with somebody. And that was before I was in office. And I remember we were just sitting, and somehow, I mean, things I talk about, Jesus and politics, I just do. And so one of my friends was talking to me about some national political thing, and another girl came over and like slammed the table. And she's like, "This is our 20-year reunion. Like, what are you doing?" So, I wasn't in politics at the time. I think now, a few years later, they're probably not surprised now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Dragon.
So you were director of marketing for Evergreen Aviation Museum, or no? Tell me, fix that for me, because I have it wrong in my notes here.
So it's so my first job, I was 21. I didn't know anything, and I just graduated. We had a kid, and so it was like, I gotta go find a job. And so I went out and I applied at Evergreen, and literally I walked in the day of my interview, and Del Smith, who was the founder chairman of the company, saw me come through the front door, and literally he's like, "You must be Dan." And I'm like, okay. Thankfully the internet existed, so I had looked up who Del Smith was, right? Like I had read his bio, and he was an impressive dude. And so he literally came out and he sat down on the front, like there were leather couches kind of in the foyer of the office building he was in, and we sat down there, and about 9:30, and I got there probably at 7:45. Every morning Evergreen had 7 o'clock meetings, so he was coming out of that meeting when he saw me come in. And so I was supposed to meet the guy at 8:30 or at 8, and I got there at 7:45. So I came in, sat down. Dell comes out, greets me. We sit down. The dude that's supposed to interview me comes out at 9:30, and he's like, "Has anybody seen this kid I'm supposed to interview?" And Dell yells back, he's like, "I've already got him hired. Like, this is a done deal." And so I had that really cool interaction, like, day zero before I even started. And so my job ultimately was to work with Mr. Smith. I followed him around. I carried his bag. I went to meetings with him. When he traveled, I would go with him for a little while. And I did that for about 6 months. And then I transitioned to the sales and marketing team for the ground logistics company. So we did warehousing service. Like Lufthansa, German Airlines flies into Portland. It was our employee that greeted you wearing a Lufthansa uniform. So instead of them buying the $2 million worth of ground handling equipment, the pushback tractor and the main deck loader and all the things you need to handle an aircraft, we had that equipment. We would service, Mexicana Airlines, and then we'd service Lufthansa, and then we'd go service Southwest. And, we were able to spread that load over many flights a day and make it affordable to offer a good service at a reasonable price. And so people didn't have to invest and bring it from overseas to do their own work. And so we did that in 48 cities throughout the U.S. and big postal service contractor as well. And then, of course, our sister company was an airline. Our other sister company was a helicopter company. So depending on what trip you were on and whether or not you were with Mr. Smith, you had to be versed in all of the operating companies, just in case he called on you and said, how much was their sales last month and who's their new contract with. And
wow.
It was an exciting time. I have a few people in my life that had worked for Evergreen and moved on to like Nike, Intel. And when I was finishing at 7 years, they're like, "Oh my God, that's like 21 years worth of experience."
But now you're doing something totally different. You own and operate Maupin Stove and Spas. So how do you get from aviation and logistics to stoves and spas?
Well, I kind of already told you. My wife just said, and we were driving over from church one day, and I remember because she said, "I'm done." And I thought, oh no, like,
oh
this
no,
could go one of two ways.
Yeah, like I thought we were getting along just fine, and she's like, "No, not with you, with the weather." And so she walked me through, the mold and mildew, the clouds, the rain, the depression, and all that. And so I was like, "Well, what do you want to do?" And she said, if we could find a place east of the Cascades, and we started looking for the small businesses. And I had always seen, in fairness, Mr. Smith benefited the most out of any employee in terms of compensation. Granted, he had all the risk. He had $400 or $500 million worth of debt at one point, and leveraging aircraft to try and keep people employed and trying to make a profit. But at the end of the day, when he wanted to build a home for himself and spend $2 million. The company just wrote the check and it happened. And so I thought, wow, someday I'd like to own something. That looks like the place I'd like to be. And, I, in my own mind, I think I thought like a $30 million aviation service company. And my wife found Maupin Stoves and Spas. It was $1 million in sales. And we moved out and we got to know the business. And it's been tremendous for us. Like the lifestyle that it's afforded us. We work hard, we lift heavy things, we install things that, are combusting logs or pellets or gas. And so we deal with dangerous things. And at the same time, we're really good at what we do. We've got a wonderful team that we work with. And with that said, it's allowed us to do things like coach basketball teams, coach soccer teams, and then ultimately, of course, run for the legislature and leave for 5 months at a time to go serve in the long session. And I've got employees that have backfilled and taken care of the business while we've been able to do that. And so it's been, the best decision outside of just, marrying my wife, moving to the Dalles and taking on that business has just been tremendous for us.
What did you, how big did you make the company? Sorry, Ben, I promise this is my last question about Daniel Bonham's business background, but it's fascinating to me. So you took it from $1 million in sales to what now?
It was like 860 when we bought it, 860,000. And so the first year we took it over $1 million, which, we thought that was crazy. Like we were so excited to do 7 figures in sales, and we'll do a little over 2 this year.
Oh, that's great. And at least until you get your tax bill, right, Ben?
Yeah.
I do encourage everyone to follow at dbonham31 on Twitter, because occasionally you'll see pictures of pools he's installing, which is very cool to see. I love those photos.
So first, a question going backwards. Did you have any, when you were in the aviation world, did you have any interactions with the young Betsy Johnson when she was doing her helicopter thing?
So no, but I'll tell you, so John Hochman resigned. It was published in the paper. And I had a friend, Tanner Elliott, here in town in the Dalles that was city councilor. And at one point I had asked him, I said, are you politically ambitious? Do you want to do something more than be a city councilor? Or are you just providing this public service? And he said, no, I think someday maybe I'd like to be John Hochman. And in that, short conversation we had, I remembered it, though, a couple years later when I saw that article. And so I called Tanner and I said, hey, John's moving on. Are you going to throw your hat in the ring? And his 2 girls were, and I don't remember, they might have been 6 and 8 at the time. And he was like, it's really not a good time for me to leave and tell my wife, hey, have fun raising the kids. He's like, but, you should consider this. And I thought, I never wanted my face on a billboard, right? I didn't go into mortgages or real estate because I myself, I don't really want to be known, but I wanted to do the work. And so my pitch to Tanner had been, I'll be your chief of staff. Like, I'll run your campaign, chief of staff, you go do the work. And he's like, I don't think we get a staff. I was like, yeah, you do. Like, I know that well enough to know that you can hire me and I can go help you do the work. And you can be the guy that has to go to the meetings, and I can be the people behind the scenes that deal with the constituent issues and some of the policy wonky stuff. Anyway, long story short, he's like, you should do it. I called my wife. I said, hey, I was having this conversation with Tanner, and he said, I should do this. And she's like,
don't you dare.
No, she was on board. She's like, you should totally do it. You love the stuff. You really enjoy it. So like, that would be something right up your alley. So I called my kids and they were like, you should do this. So I called John. He didn't answer. I left him a message. And then I called Rod Runyon, who is the county commissioner, because in the article it said the county commissioners will make this appointment. So I called Rod and he was like, you need to get a hold of the PCP people. There's a process. And so I'm learning all this as I go. And this is like Wednesday and the convention was Saturday.
Oh my God.
So I went down to the convention on Saturday. I put on my suit and tie. I passed out a little flyer that I created for myself. And I convinced those people that I would make a good choice. And, again, learned politics at that meeting as well. I watched as I convinced a couple PCP captains that I was the right guy. And then I watched them work the room for me. Like I got elected through that process because other people bought into the idea that I would do a good job more so than I was super fast, fascinating to anybody. Like the couple people I convinced then were my champions, and I watched it happen, and it was a lesson I learned and have remembered well. But then the week in between that meeting and the commissioner appointment the following weekend was AOC down in Eugene. So the annual county commissioner conference. So I thought, oh my gosh, I get to go compel these people to vote for me. I get to try and convince them that I'm the right guy. And so I have the captive audience. They're all going to be in the same place. So I can go visit instead of having to drive out to Wheeler County and down to Deschutes and Jefferson to track these people down. They're all going to be in Eugene.
Yeah.
So I drove down there, right? And I took my little campaign material I put together, and I met Bill Hansel and talked to Bill for like an hour about what the job would be. And I connected with my county commissioners. And the final day, they're giving this presentation, this panel on wildfire. And this woman with these big glasses up on stage. I'm like, that's familiar. Like, she really, like, I know this woman. And so her panel's done. They leave. Another panel goes up. They finish. Thank you all for coming. Goodbye. And I thought, I should have found her before she left. Like, I'm sure she's gone by now. The room clears out. The only two people left in the room are Betsy Johnson and I. And so I walked over to her and I was like, hey, Senator Johnson, like, you mentioned in her spiel that you were one of the first female aviators to fly a helicopter and fight fire. I said, so who did you fly for? And she says, who the hell are you? She grabs my off my name tag, and it said Daniel Bonham, like City Budget Committee, because I was serving on it. Yeah, that was my credentials for getting into that meeting. And then she kind of threw it back at my chest, like, why are you bothering me? And I said, I just, I was in aviation for a little while, and you just seem so familiar. She said, well, who the hell did you work for? I said, I worked for Del Smith. And she said, well, I served on Del's board. And I literally did this to her. I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, your thing was, he had all the board members' headshots outside of the boardroom. I said, so that's how I know you. I said, I don't think we ever really met, but I know who you are. And immediately, and for people that don't know Senator Johnson, she's fantastic, but she does keep some things in her pocket up around her chest. And so she reaches in trying to pull out a business card, and she said, I'm all out of business cards. She takes a scrap of paper and she writes, Betsy Johnson. She said, I'm so sorry. Normally there's this little gold leaf emblem right here. And she takes a pen, he draws a little emblem, and she said, I hope that'll suffice. But she wrote her number on there, and she said, if you get through this process, call me. And so the following weekend, it was a Sunday, and I got through the process. I called her. And again, she's like, who the hell are you? And I said, I'm the guy that, Matt, that worked at Evergreen. And just like Bill Hansel did, she took like an hour and a half to answer every question I had, talked about the upcoming short session, said, listen, you're going to get down to Salem, and I-84 is going to ice over, and you're not going to be able to get home to see your wife. Make sure she knows that, this job may carry over on some weekends, and talk to your kids about the fact that they're going to read in Twitter about what a boob their dad is. Like, just warn them. She said, because I didn't necessarily get that warning when Sam, her dad, was in the legislature. She's like, I remember this one, reserve the language. I won't say what she said, but she said there's one person that wrote an article about my dad, and I can tell you his name to this day. And I remember him, very vividly with a lot of angst towards him to this day, because he wrote some nasty things about my dad. No one had said, hey, this could happen. And so very personal advice, very family oriented, meant the world to me. Bill Hansel, again, the same thing. And so the first two legislators I met were just tremendously kind and have been absolutely wonderful mentors during my time in the building too.
And that was Bill Hansel and Betsy Johnson.
Yeah.
That's cool. Wow. So I want to transition now so you got appointed to the State House. What was that, 2 terms in the State House or 3?
So I was appointed in November 17, elected in 18 and 20. And so I'm running out for the Senate in 22. And
so I was curious, because your Senate race, I think, different people have different race ratings, but on paper, I think it's pretty close to even, right, in terms of Democrats and Republicans in the district. I imagine you're doing a lot of door-to-door, maybe phone calls. You're certainly talking to constituents. What are people talking about right now? What are you hearing in your community that people are upset about or nervous about on the campaign trail?
So affordable housing is a big one.
Yeah.
And it's not just, young people that are trying to start out, but parents of young people, grandparents of young people that are saying, how does a person getting started in life right now get into a home? That's probably number one. I'm probably hearing more about that than anything. And I was a little surprised by that. It's really transitioned from the primary. The primary was, a lot of election integrity, a lot of homelessness and crime, affordability. And those things are still out there. Like, I will say, like, none of those things have gone away. Like, people haven't crossed those things off their list, but it feels like affordability and specifically tied to housing and housing supply is jumped to number one. And a close second is the homelessness and the crime, drug issue that kind of goes along with homelessness that people are experiencing. And I will say that it's hotter and heavier at one end of my district than the other. On the side of the district, I hear more about the homelessness in general, but not necessarily the crime and the drugs. The closer you get to Portland, Clackamas County, people are really seeing that. They're seeing it creep into their neighborhoods. People that are in small business or that work in the Portland area are just appalled by what Portland has become. So I hear a lot about that.
Do your constituents, we were just talking to Senator Armitage, who represents Senator Johnson's old district, and she, like, the language that a lot of her constituents using are like, keep Portland out, like, we don't want Portland coming. Are you hearing that kind of language?
Yeah, no one has said don't Portland my Oregon, but they all wear the t-shirt. So like,
yeah. So that's where they're coming from. In terms of housing, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the answer for me is always a supply and demand issue. Our land use laws have restricted supply of land so much so that if you restrict anything, like, why do diamonds cost what they cost? De Beers controls the flow of diamonds into the world. If you let all the diamonds into the world, they'd be worthless because there's so many that are out there. But by restricting flow, you can keep the price elevated. And so, it's such a simple supply and demand lesson from Economics 101 that I don't understand why the state hasn't pivoted. I don't know why they're not incentivizing like certain types of affordable housing to the extent that they can. There are no apartments being built in this area of the gorge. There are like mobile home parks that are being built in this part of the gorge. Like, the kind of restricting things to this idealistic dense house of a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex to the extent that they can infill, but then they're still pushing single family residences out into areas of acreage. And so it's a challenge, and it's not just on the housing side. When you get into this land use stuff, we're at a short supply of industrial land as well. And the gorge has unique challenges because of the National Scenic Act. We've got a group that's supposed to be advocating on behalf of not just the beauty and the nature, the natural environment out here, but their number two and equal focus is supposed to be economic development. And yet they focus on one and the other goes by the wayside. So when DLCD is telling people, hey, you have enough land out there, well, are you considering the fact that Google controls 80% of the land that's available land? And so how much land really have that's available to develop? And can you call that a 20-year supply when one entity has been able to control the majority of that land? So, we've got some serious land use things that we're going to have to talk about, but we can't solve housing supply without getting rid of some regulation, some tax, and expanding capacity of available lands.
Is it really that stark in terms of Google's land ownership? Is it like that significant?
Right now, yeah.
And they're not
allotted industrial land here in the Dalles. They have acquired that much land, yeah.
And they're using it for their purposes, or they're just land banking it for when they need it?
A little bit of both. Okay. I mean, they have plans to expand, and they have expanded at a timetable that I think people are comfortable with in terms of that commitment and that control of the land. But at the same time, it does limit the other industrial potential buyers, other manufacturers from even being able to consider it. So
I didn't know that. Reagan?
So one of the other things I think that probably impacts your district and a lot of the districts really in Oregon, because the trees are just everywhere here. That's one of the things that people who are not from Oregon, and especially Congress, I think, you see Ron Wyden on TV, actually on Fox Channel, talking about how bad wildfire is and how we need better forestry management, right? And everybody in Oregon has opinions on trees, but the rest of the country doesn't really understand how many trees we have here. So forestry tends to be a major discussion point. Everyone's got their opinion on forestry. What's your view on forestry, and do you have particular focus in that policy area?
When you look at how much of our state is forest, it's 50% of the state. When you look at how much of our state is controlled by the federal government, it's 50%. It's not the same 50%, but it's interesting to have those two numbers kind of in your head. Also, since you mentioned Senator Wyden, I'll take a pot shot at him that I've been very according to his commercials, how much he's done for rural Oregon. It'd be interesting to actually have him truly engage with Eastern Oregon and not just dictate to Eastern Oregon what he's going to do. But his commercials certainly make it sound like he's doing wonderful things for us. And I find that fascinating. Showing up to a town hall where you only invite your constituency and people that agree with you, that show up and just kind of parrot back to you what you want to hear, is not true engagement. But I wish we could get some serious people to run for the U.S. Senate, somebody that lives in Oregon, somebody that's from Oregon, somebody that shares Oregon values. I truly think of Ron Wyden as a New Yorker that just moonlights as an Oregonian. Back to forestry, it's interesting. We went through a pretty comprehensive review of where we're at during that wildfire group that the governor convened. I was originally on that group, and then when now Senator Finley was in the House with his experience at BLM, I said, hey, I should step aside. You've been fighting fires for 30 years professionally. Maybe you're someone with more experience than I have. And so I stepped aside, but I paid attention to what that group was doing. And the governor, I think, identified $4 billion worth of treatment work in the next 20 years. It was $200 million a year for 20 years that she wanted to see treat the 1 million acres that we had that were untreated. And the question, of course, becomes, how do you pay for it? How do you sustain that type of investment? So the first bill I ever ran, first bill I passed, was a bill called the Good Neighbor Authority bill. And the Good Neighbor Authority is an agreement that the state of Oregon has with the federal government that allows us to do work on federal lands. And so that money that we banked within that legislative concept that ultimately was passed is about $500,000. And what that money went to was NEPA certification. So you've got this national environment review that has to be done before you can do a timber sale. And so ultimately, any timber sale through the Good Neighbor Authority has to be additive. It can't be something that's already in the pipeline. So the Good Neighbor Authority truly is doing extra projects. So what other states have done, like Idaho and I think it's Minnesota, they've been able to build this kind of pot of money to where you do the timber sale, and then that money goes into the pot, and then you use the pot to do the next NEPA certification, and then that gets the next sale, and you have this revolving kind of credit line within your budgetary process to continue to do more work in forestry. And that was my hope. So the first year we passed the bill, we got some money allocated. They did do 5 specific projects that they got through with that money. And of course, ODF came back and they were like, this was fantastic. This was a success. They called the money, the 4118 based on the bill number money. And so it's something they came back to me and said that, thank you for doing that. This was great. And so I worked with David Brock Smith to then create a budgetary bucket to where we could start to try and create this cycle, and just never really got buy-in from the majority party to want to do that. And so it's something that will continue to plague Oregonians. What's the saying? Harvest it, pick it, or watch it burn. I can't remember how to get. It's something like that. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're just in this vicious cycle of fighting fires, and they are intense. And to the extent that people want to point to climate change, I really do want to point to mismanagement. Like, we have all this undergrowth. We have, timber sales that are through the NEPA certification that should move forward. And then because of our laws, somebody can come along and sue the state or the federal government, put a stay on that timber sale. And what we had experienced here 2 years ago down in South Wasco County was literally a area of land that was supposed to have been thinned through a timber sale that ultimately caught fire. And it was because somebody sued and stopped the timber sale. And the fire may have still happened, but they're not as intense, and they're not able to grow the way they can when there's that much fuel.
Two quick thoughts on that. One, if you haven't, you should check out Governor Kitzhaber's presentation to the Board of Forestry a few months ago, where he actually uses similar language to what you just said about forest management practices contributing to where we are now, and how he thinks there's an opportunity to connect wildfire policy, forest policy, and housing policy together to try to create a market for some of the less desirable wood products that come out of forest management practices, and ensure that the wood is processed in Oregon, creating more jobs, and that we dedicate the use of those resources to building housing, which gets to your first point. It's a big, large, complex idea, and I don't fully get it. In fact, I tried to cite it in my Willamette Week interview, and they just like roasted me because I do not understand the details well enough. But that was my first thing. And then I was also curious if you've ever spoken to or former Secretary of State Phil Kiesling about forest stuff.
So I don't know Phil Kiesling. My brother, who was a poli-sci major at U of O, actually worked on the Phil Kiesling campaign when he ran for state. So I should have an in if my brother Kevin would introduce us. But I've never met the man.
You should talk to him too. He had an idea. I thought of him because he introduced a concept to me with a similar like financing mechanism to your idea. I think the bill passed in the 90s, but the very next session, boom and bust cycle, they took all the money away. So I don't know what the state of the program is, but basically the pitch is essentially there's a bunch of land in Oregon that is perfect for growing forests on, that is not currently being used for agriculture. So it's basically just sitting there, and it's got like brush growing or like types of trees that aren't super helpful ecologically or economically. And so the pitch is basically like get a one-time legislative allocation of a certain amount of money to, and these are privately held lands, I should say. They're owned by private owners. Get the legislature to allocate money to go plant a bunch of coniferous trees across all these, like it's literally like, I want to say millions of acres. It's tons of land in Oregon that fall in this designation. And then the landowners have a couple choices. One, they can just let the trees grow if they want that to happen. That's carbon mitigation. That's awesome. Okay. And eventually, when an owner comes along and decides to do harvest, they pay a certain percentage of the profits that they make back into this pot of money. And so you just create this cycle of like more trees growing across the state and more production. And it's still a net gain. There's no net loss from the program. So I thought of that when you were explaining the financing mechanism.
And I think that's fantastic. I'm curious, like when you mentioned Kitzhaber's idea, one of the challenges that exists today, Highway 97 used to have 23 mills along the highway, runs from Washington to California across Central Oregon. There's one left down in Gilchrist. So part of the challenge with how do you entice the state back into this enterprise is getting the folks from industry to say, I'm willing to invest the millions of dollars to start the mill back up, with uncertainty as to whether or not the next administration or the next group of legislators comes along and says, no, wait, we're back to being anti-harvesting of trees, and you're back at a bit. Well, now I just invested, $14 million to get this mill back up and running, and I'm out because I ran it for 2 years with success, and you're telling me you don't want to be in this business anymore. So, part of it is going to convince industry that we're committed to long-term harvesting of timber. And I do think, the fact of the matter, there are more trees in Oregon today than there have ever been in the history of the state. More trees planted, more trees growing. It's just areas where there weren't trees before that we now have trees. The way we've carpeted the forest, like we've jam-packed trees in together because you can't harvest anything with a certain diameter. And so trees are growing closer together, and there's smaller trees. And the reality is, if you want the old growth timber, I think anybody that knows forest, you actually thinning will help you get bigger trees. When trees aren't competing for nutrients from the soil or for sunlight, they have the opportunity to grow bigger, broader, taller, all those things. So, forestry is an interesting topic. It's something that I do think Oregon could just be the worldwide champion of. It's still, top production export good here in the state of Oregon, but we could just be world renowned for it. Instead, we're in my opinion, clinging to an industry that should just be thriving.
So now for our most important topic. As podcast hosts, Ben and I love other podcasts, or at least I do. I don't know about Ben.
I do, yes.
I think he probably listens to all the NPR podcasts. So full disclosure, I designed the artwork for your podcast, Main Street Politics, with Representative Daniel Bonham. Just tell us briefly, what was your experience about starting the podcast and then having it?
Well, my staff at the time, Dylan Amo, was just trying to be creative. Like, how do we reach different people? You go on the radio when you're back home, you're familiar with that media, could we do something like that? And so he did the research, and Dylan, bought the equipment, and we just started kind of brainstorming about what we would do in terms of approach. And I think at first, because I was so new to the process and I had so many people say, hey, I'm curious, write a book about how you got involved, or and I was like, I don't have an interest in that, but I thought I could start to interview people along the lines of, why do you do this? Why do you feel compelled to do this? Who should want to do this? Is there an ideal candidate as you're recruiting? Mike McLean, was leader at the time. Are you looking for anybody in particular? What compelled you to get into this? Interviewed Cliff Bentz, Newt Bueller, Bev Clarno, Betsy Johnson came on the podcast. I've had Peter Courtney, one of my favorite episodes I've ever recorded.
I listened to that one.
Stressed me out because I hosted, I was vice chair of business and labor. And so I think it was Monday at 1:30 before our 2:00 committee hearing, I hosted a call with my fellow Republicans and a few people from industry to try and, make sure we were aware of everything that was in the bills and what we were planning on doing for the upcoming meeting. And so we planned this interview with Peter at noon. And I thought, 45 minutes, right? That's how long you want a podcast to be. At 1:30, we're still recording. And I was enjoying it so much. I was like, I'm not going to walk away from this. But I tried to do this real quick to send Shelly a note, Shelly Bossart Davis, to say, hey, run the meeting for me. And by the time because he looked over at his staff and I sent the text. And by the time I set it down, he caught me. And he's like, oh, Bonham, you got more work to do. I get it. You don't want to be doing this anymore. You got places to be. Oh, I guess I better go. I'm sorry for taking up too much of your time. Like, oh, Peter, no, I don't want to insult you in any way, shape, or form. I just, that dude is so awesome. He's, again, you talk about characters and the building and whatnot. And I always hear people talk about the swamp in DC and the swamp in Salem. Get to know some of these individuals on a personal basis, and you can disagree with their politics all you want, but that dude is dynamite. We had some family health issues, and he was like, I'm there for you. I know people at OHSU. Let me make some calls on your behalf. He took the time to walk over from the Senate to come find me and talk to me about this personal family health issue we had. And I was touched, and he's just a great dude. I don't agree with everything he's done politically, but I would go walk through 5 miles of snow, staring at the sun the whole way uphill to take care of him if he ever needed anything from me.
I know, Reagan, we've got a hard stop coming up soon, but my Peter Courtney story is I was a staffer for Val Hoyle when she was majority leader. And Val was in with, I don't even know, she was in a meeting in her office with a constituent or something. And Peter Courtney comes walking across that sort of outdoor walkway he comes into the office and he's like, I want to talk to Val. And so Val's scheduler gets up and says to Val, Senate President Courtney is here and wants to chat with you. And Val says, okay, give me 1 minute to wrap it up. And she comes out and says, 1 minute, she'll be ready in 1 minute. And he waits for maybe 15 seconds. And he says, I get it. I'm not important enough to talk to the majority leader. That's fine. And he goes out and he starts walking across the hallway. So Val comes out, chases after him after the walkway to go talk to him. And I was like, I could never tell if he was serious, if he was being self-deprecating, if he was joking. Like, it never was quite clear to me what was happening.
All the above.
Yes.
And one of the greatest things that'll ever happen, and maybe you in 30 years, you can go back when everybody that maybe he's, passed away or left Oregon or whatever it is, and all the people he talks about are gone. And then because that podcast episode is only 45 minutes long, which means there are some stuff that's never been heard that won't be heard for decades. That is probably just awesome that no one will ever know about.
I'll tell you straight up, it'll never be heard. He
It's already been burned.
He came into the room and he took a jab at me right off the bat. So I was prepared. Like, I had some written lines. I had done some research with Roger Byer and other people that had served with him. And so I turned around and I slung mud right back at him. And he was like, oh, I see how it is. You bring the Democrat on here and you just and I was like, hey, buddy, you started it. And so he said something else. And then I teased him about being a career politician. He's like, really? Is this the way you do this? And I said, oh, hold on. I said, time out. I said, I forgot to tell you, like, literally, we're going to go back. We're going to edit this whole thing. We're going to chop it up. We'll make it sound like it's a streaming conversation. But if you say anything you don't want said, I'm not publishing that, and I never will. And we did get into a few topics where he called me the next week and he said,
it's like,
I really wish we hadn't talked about that. Like, I got home and I told my wife, and then what made me happiest was when we finally did publish it, his wife listened. And he called me and he said, I just want you to know that my wife says that you're a class act. I refuse to listen to it because I the whole thing. But she says that you did a good job. And that made me happy.
That's awesome. Well, I think that is all the time we have for this interview. But Representative, I want to say thank you for making time. I know this is like peak campaign season. You got a lot of work to do in your district. And so we appreciate you making time to chat with us. And after the election, we'd love to have you back. Reagan, any closing thoughts before we let Representative Bonham make a plug?
Yeah, I want to know if you could pick one political figure from American history that is like your icon or your who you're trying to measure up to, or even just try to emulate a little bit, or you just admire. Who would you pick?
I mean, there's no greater inspiration than Ronald Reagan. Like, there just isn't. I'll still go back right now if I've got a long drive and I'm driving through an area where I don't have good reception. I know I can't make phone calls, and I'll download like a YouTube speech and I'll just listen to him talk. You know, he did a national broadcast on education. I pulled that up, listened to that for like an hour. He's just awesome. And you know, the people that I have had the opportunity to meet, Condoleezza Rice, holy cow, like, brilliant. Like, man, why aren't we electing people like this to be president of the United States? Like, she's too smart. She wouldn't do it. Right. She's like, no, thank you. But yeah, there's been some awesome people that I've had the opportunity through my days at Evergreen, and then just now being part of this gig. It's been fascinating to see, you know, some doors open up to get to meet people. But, you know, you might think I'm a little silly, but it is an honor to be friends with Christine Drazan. She's phenomenal. I think the world of her. Shelley Bosshart Davis is another wonderful friend and colleague. Our caucus has just been neat. I came in at a fun time with some savvy veterans that have been there for 10, 15 years, and then a whole crop of new people that were just trying to discover what this world was. And so I'm thankful for those relationships. And yeah, I think someday we'll look back and say, I knew Christine Drazan win.
That's awesome. Well, Representative Bonham, where can people find you?
DanielBonham.com. 7 years ago, I picked up all the domain names that had all my family names, and now all of a sudden it's actually handy. But that's the best. And then my cell phone number is on everything. If I've sent literature out, you've got it. If you get onto my Facebook page, you've got it. People have been really kind and thoughtful in terms of the way they've engaged with me on my cell phone. So long as people are cool about reaching out at appropriate times, I'll keep having it public. And then people will track me down on Facebook Messenger. Like, there's plenty of ways to get me. Hopefully you'll be able to track me down in January in Salem in my new Senate office.
All right.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you very
Thanks
much,
so much.
Representative Bonham. We'll see you next time.
Thank you both.